Welcome to Echoes of the Midnight, a channel where every whisper hides a haunting truth. Sit back, turn off the lights, and let the midnight tales pull you into their chilling embrace. The question is, can you make it to the end? The small town of Hollow Pines lay buried under a pristine blanket of snow, its streets dotted with lampposts wrapped in garlands of evergreen and golden lights. Christmas decorations adorned every window, casting a soft, magical glow that flickered against the icy frost creeping up the glass. Clara gazed out of the frosted bust window as she approached her destination, feeling an odd mix of nostalgia and unease. It had been years since she'd visited her grandmother in this quiet, secluded town. The world outside seemed like a holiday postcard brought to life, yet something about the scene felt wrong. Not outright ominous, but strange enough to make the hairs on her neck rise. The snow seemed too perfect, the silence too heavy, as if the town were holding its breath. Even the cheerful decorations seemed out of place, as though they were masking something far less pleasant. The bus wheezed to a halt in front of Hollow Pines' modest station. Clara stepped off, the chill biting at her cheeks. A faint scent of pine mingled with the cold air, and her boots crunched on the fresh snow. A handful of people moved quickly through the streets, heads down and collars up, avoiding eye contact. Clara clutched her suitcase tightly and shrugged off the sense of isolation. Her grandmother Agnes greeted her warmly at the door of a weathered but charming Victorian house at the edge of town. A wreath of holly hung above the entryway, and the faint aroma of cinnamon wafted from inside. The warmth of the house enveloped Clara as she stepped inside, but her grandmother's hug was tighter than usual, almost desperate. "You've grown so much, my dear," Agnes said, her voice warm but tinged with melancholy. Clara smiled and kissed her on the cheek. "I've missed you, Grandma," Clara said, though she couldn't help but notice the way Agnes glanced toward the window, as if expecting something, or someone. The house was cozy and alive with the spirit of Christmas. Twinkling lights adorned a tree in the corner, stockings were hung on the fireplace, and the dining table was set with care. Yet, despite the holiday cheer, Agnes seemed on edge. As they sat down to tea that evening, her grandmother's cheer faded completely. "You mustn't go out after dark," Agnes said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Her voice trembled, her teacup rattling slightly as she set it down. Clara raised an eyebrow. "What? Why not? Is it dangerous?" Agnes hesitated, her gaze fixed on the fireplace. "It's not like the city here, Clara. This town, it has its traditions, its warnings. There are things you wouldn't believe." A shiver ran down Clara's spine at her grandmother's words, though she forced a laugh to break the tension. "What are you talking about? Ghost stories? Monsters in the woods?" Agnes shook her head. "No, child. Worse than that. The Wanderer." Her voice dropped to a whisper, as if the name alone carried weight. "Every Christmas Eve, it comes. The town knows to stay inside, to lock the doors and hide their hearts." "Wanderer?" Clara repeated, incredulous. "You're serious?" "Deadly serious." Agnes leaned forward, her face pale. "It finds those with sins weighing on their souls, punishes them, takes them. No one has ever escaped its wrath." Clara's lips twitched with a smirk, but her grandmother's expression didn't change. "Grandma, come on, that sounds like something out of a fairy tale." "It's no fairy tale," Agnes said sharply, her voice shaking. "People have vanished. My own sister Ruth—" Her words caught in her throat, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. The seriousness in her grandmother's tone gave Clara pause. She wanted to dismiss the story as an old wives' tale, but the fear in Agnes's eyes told her otherwise. Clara reached across the table and squeezed her grandmother's hand. "I'll be fine," Clara assured her. "I'm just here for a quiet Christmas. No sins to be punished for." Agnes withdrew her hand and gave a weak smile, but her gaze lingered on the window. "Promise me you won't go outside tonight, Clara. Just this once. Listen to me." Clara promised, though the faintest edge of rebellion stirred in her chest. Later, as she settled into the guest room, she found herself unable to shake the unease. Snow fell gently against the window pane, the sound of the world muffled. The town seemed wrapped in a bubble of quiet tension. Before she drifted to sleep, she thought she saw a figure standing in the snow outside. A tall, thin shadow that seemed to stare at her window. When she blinked, it was gone, leaving only an odd, hollow impression in the snow. The next morning, Clara woke to the soft glow of daylight illuminating the frost on her window. The house was quiet, but the air felt heavy. After a quick breakfast with her grandmother, she decided to explore Hollow Pines. Bundled in her coat and scarf, she ventured out, eager to rekindle old memories of the town. The town square was quaint and picturesque, with a towering Christmas tree at its center, decorated with shimmering ornaments. Yet, despite its charm, an unsettling stillness hung over everything. The townsfolk she encountered moved briskly, their faces tight with unease. They avoided her gaze, nodding politely but offering no smiles. Clara brushed it off, attributing their coldness to the weather. By early afternoon, the shops began closing, owners flipping their signs to closed with hurried motions. Clara noticed how they cast wary glances at the lengthening shadows, as if something ominous lurked just beyond the light. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the streets were eerily empty. Back at her grandmother's house, Agnes was pacing by the window, her fingers twitching as she repeatedly peeked past the curtains. "You'll stay in tonight, won't you?" she asked sharply, her voice taut. "Of course, Grandma," Clara replied, though her curiosity prickled at the edges of her thoughts. Her grandmother's fear seemed overblown, and part of her wanted to prove the old legends wrong. As darkness deepened, Clara slipped on her coat and scarf, ignoring Agnes's anxious gaze as she quietly left the house. The town was utterly still, the air colder than she remembered. Her boots crunched on the snow, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. The festive decorations looked different now, their cheerful glow dimmed under the pale moonlight. Snowmen stood along the streets, their button eyes dull and lifeless. As she passed them, a chill crept up her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that their hollow gazes followed her. A faint sound reached her ears, a melody drifting through the air. At first, it seemed like carolers, but the tune was off, the notes discordant and chilling. Clara stopped and scanned the empty street. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaking. There was no answer, only the haunting melody, growing louder. The fog came suddenly, rolling in like a living thing, curling around her feet and climbing higher until the world dissolved into an eerie white haze. Clara turned, her heart racing, as the familiar streets warped into an unrecognizable labyrinth. Landmarks she thought she knew were twisted, distorted into shadows of themselves. "Grandma?" she called out, her voice swallowed by the fog. As she turned again, she froze. A snowman stood in the middle of the street where none had been before, its coal eyes deep and dark. Its stick arms were raised as if mocking her, its jagged grin etched into its frozen face. Clara stumbled back, nearly slipping on the icy ground. The caroling stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it made her ears ring. She scrambled to her feet, and in the distance a shadow moved. A tall, thin figure glided through the fog, its movements smooth and deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat. "Who's there?" she called, but the figure didn't respond. She took a hesitant step back, then another, only to find the shadow closer now, as if the fog itself carried it toward her. Panic surged, and Clara turned and ran, her boots slipping on the icy streets. The world around her twisted and stretched, every turn leading her to more unfamiliar ground. Finally, she stumbled into the town square, collapsing onto the snow near the Christmas tree. The ornaments were cracked, the once bright lights flickering weakly. The snowmen that lined the square now bore jagged grins and glistening black eyes, their stick arms reaching toward her like claws. She gasped for air, her chest tight with fear. When she glanced up, she saw it, a gaunt figure standing at the edge of the square. Its form was clearer now, draped in tattered cloth, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Though it didn't move, she felt its gaze pierce her, heavy and unrelenting. The silence pressed down on her, so oppressive it was hard to breathe. Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, the eerie caroling resumed, soft and warped, echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. The caroling twisted and distorted as Clara stood frozen, her breath catching in her chest. The gaunt figure loomed closer, its outline becoming disturbingly clear. Its cloak, once festive red and white, was now tattered and stained with streaks of shadowy black. Clara's eyes widened in horror as she took in its pale, gaunt face, the hollow eyes glowing faintly like dying embers. When it spoke her name, its voice rasped like dry leaves scraping against stone. "Clara," it hissed, stretching the syllables, as if savoring them. Clara stumbled backward, her legs trembling beneath her. "What? Are you?" She managed to stammer. Her voice sounded small and fragile, barely cutting through the heavy silence that pressed around her. The figure tilted its head, an unnatural movement that made Clara's stomach churn. "You know who I am," it rasped. "You've carried me with you for years." "Do you mean?" Clara asked, her voice quaking. She tried to move, but her legs felt rooted to the snow. The fog thickened, coiling around her ankles like chains. "I am the keeper of truth, the reckoner of guilt," it said, stepping closer, its skeletal hand emerging from its cloak. "I am the wanderer." The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said quickly, her voice rising in desperation. "You've got the wrong person." The wanderer's hollow eyes seemed to burn brighter, and its lips curled into a grim parody of a smile. "No one is without sin," it whispered, and with a wave of its bony hand, the snow around Clara darkened, twisting into an inky black void. Shadows rose from the ground, grotesque forms clawing their way into existence. Clara gasped as the shadows morphed, taking the shape of faces she recognized. Her own face, twisted in anger. Her best friend, Rachel, her expression frozen in anguish. "No," Clara breathed, shaking her head. "This isn't real." The wanderer ignored her protests. "You left her," it said, its voice like a blade cutting through the air. When she needed you most, you turned away. And for what? Your pride? Your fear? I didn't... Clara began, but her voice faltered as the shadow of Rachel stepped closer, her eyes wide and pleading. I didn't mean to... she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. The memory came rushing back, vivid and unrelenting. Rachel had called her late one night, her voice trembling, begging for help, but Clara, overwhelmed with her own struggles, had ignored the call. She hadn't learned until later that Rachel had been found the next morning, lost and broken, unable to face her demons alone. The shadows closed in around her, their whispers growing louder. Clara clutched her head, trying to block out the voices. "Stop it!" she screamed. "I didn't know. I couldn't have known." The wanderer's laughter was cold and hollow, a sound that cut through her like ice. "Ignorance does not absolve guilt," it said. "You carry her with you, Clara, and you will carry her until the end." Clara broke into a run, her heart pounding as she pushed through the fog. She didn't know where she was going, but anywhere had to be better than facing the horrors behind her. The shadows reached for her, their cold hands brushing against her skin as she darted through the thick mist. Every turn brought her back to the same place, the square, the snowmen now leering at her with jagged grins, and there at the center stood the wanderer, waiting. It didn't chase her. It didn't need to. It simply appeared, no matter how far she ran. "What do you want from me?" Clara shouted, her voice breaking. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, her vision blurred with tears. "Why are you doing this?" The wanderer raised its hand again, and the shadows paused, their whispers falling silent. "This is not about what I want," it said. "This is about what you must face." The ground beneath Clara shifted, and she fell to her knees, her hands sinking into the icy snow. Images flashed in the fog, memories she had tried to bury. Rachel's face, her voice, her pain. Clara shook her head, the tears flowing freely now. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't do this." "You must," the wanderer said, its voice devoid of pity, "or the burden will consume you." Clara closed her eyes, her body trembling. The whispers of the shadows returned, but this time they were softer, almost mournful. She thought of Rachel, of the friendship they had shared, and the guilt that had gnawed at her ever since. Slowly, she opened her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I should have been there for you. I should have answered the call. I let you down, and I've hated myself for it ever since." The fog seemed to thin slightly, and the shadows wavered. Clara turned to face the wanderer, her fists clenched. "But I can't change the past," she said, her voice growing stronger. "All I can do is try to make things right." The wanderer studied her, its hollow eyes flickering. For a moment, it seemed almost human, as if her words had touched something buried deep within its skeletal form. Then it stepped back, its shadowy figure fading into the mist. The snow around Clara lightened, and the whispers of the shadows faded into silence. She was alone again, the town square, eerily still. Her heart was still racing, but the crushing weight in her chest had lifted, slightly. Clara stood, her legs shaking. The fog lingered at the edges of the square, but she could see a path ahead, faint and uncertain. She took a deep breath and began to walk. Behind her, the figure of the wanderer remained, its glowing eyes watching from the shadows. Clara's lungs burned as she stumbled through the icy fog, her knees buckling beneath her. The relentless cold gnawed at her skin, and her tears froze on her cheeks. The shadows twisted and writhed around her, whispering sins she hadn't even realized she'd buried. Her foot struck something solid, and she fell hard onto the frozen ground, groaning in pain. When she raised her head, she saw it, a towering old church silhouetted against the hazy moonlight. The building seemed untouched by the corruption that had overtaken the town. Its steeple reached defiantly into the sky, and though cracks marred its weathered stone walls, the faint glow of candlelight flickered within. Desperate for refuge, Clara pulled herself to her feet and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The creak echoed through the still air, and she hesitated, half expecting the wanderer to be waiting inside. But the space was empty, the air warmer than she'd felt in hours. The interior was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Faded frescoes adorned the walls, their images of angels and saints worn with age but still serene. Broken pews lined the aisle, their splinters illuminated by the soft glow of dozens of candles. At the altar stood a lectern, upon which rested a massive, ancient tome. Clara approached it cautiously, her footsteps muffled by a layer of dust that coated the stone floor. The book was bound in cracked leather, its edges frayed. She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she flipped it open. The yellowed pages were filled with sprawling, spidery script that seemed to shift and writhe as she read. It spoke of the Wanderer, a being born from the collective guilt of a cursed town, a spirit that fed on unspoken truths and punished those who refused to confront their sins. Clara's throat tightened as she read the final lines. The guilty may only find solace in confession. Redemption is a path walked alone, yet its light may guide others. Clara's gaze darted toward the windows. The fog pressed against the glass, and faint whispers seeped through the cracks in the door. She could feel the spirit's presence, closer now, waiting for her to falter. Her heart raced as she slammed the book shut and turned to face the empty pews. "I'm done running," she cried, her voice breaking through the oppressive silence. "I've carried this guilt for too long." She stepped into the aisle, her voice trembling but resolute. "Rachel, I'm sorry," she said, her words echoing off the ancient walls. "I should have been there for you. I should have answered your call. I thought I couldn't handle your problems, but I didn't even try." Tears streamed down her face as she clenched her fists, the memories flooding back with painful clarity. "You needed me, and I failed you. I've hated myself for it ever since, but hating myself didn't help you. I was a coward, and I'm sorry." The air around her shifted. The whispers grew louder, swelling into a mournful cacophony that made her knees buckle. The floor beneath her trembled, and the candles flickered violently, casting wild shadows across the walls. But Clara didn't stop. "I'm done letting guilt control me," she shouted, her voice rising over the noise. "I won't let it define who I am anymore. I'm ready to make it right, not just for Rachel, but for everyone I've hurt. I want to do better." The church shuddered, as if alive, and the fog outside began to peel away in jagged strips, revealing faint glimpses of moonlight. Clara's chest heaved as she braced herself for the spirit's judgment. The Wanderer materialized at the end of the aisle, its hollow eyes blazing like twin embers. The figure moved closer, its skeletal hand outstretched. Clara's instincts screamed at her to run, but she held her ground, staring into the depths of its gaze. "You've punished me enough," she said, her voice steady. "I'll take responsibility for my choices, but you don't own me anymore." The wanderer paused, its hand hovering inches from her face. For a long, agonizing moment, the two stood frozen. Then, the spirit withdrew, its eyes flickering dimly. "You have chosen the harder path," it rasped. "Redemption is not forgiveness. It is labor and pain and sacrifice." "I'll take it," Clara said, her voice firm. "Whatever it takes." The spirit tilted its head, considering her. Slowly, it lowered its hand, and the shadows surrounding Clara began to dissolve. The church stilled, the tremors fading into silence. The wanderer's form grew fainter, its edges unraveling like mist. Before it vanished completely, it spoke one final time. "Remember this, Clara. Guilt is a weight shared by many. Your light may save others, but their darkness will try to claim you. Be ready." And then it was gone. The church was quiet again, the candles burning steadily. Clara fell to her knees, the weight in her chest lifting for the first time in years. Outside, the last of the fog dissipated, revealing the snow-covered streets of Hollow Pines, bathed in pale moonlight. Clara rose slowly, her legs trembling. She wasn't sure what lay ahead, but she knew one thing. She had been given a second chance, and she would not waste it. When Clara opened her eyes, the first thing she noticed was the warmth of sunlight streaming through her window. For a moment she lay still, her heart pounding as fragments of the previous night surfaced in her mind. The fog, the shadows, the wanderer. It all felt like a distant nightmare. But as she sat up and looked out the window, she realized it wasn't a dream. The streets of Hollow Pines were blanketed in pristine snow, glistening under the pale light of Christmas morning. Gone was the oppressive fog, the haunting whispers, and the malevolent presence that had chased her through the night. The town looked peaceful, almost untouched. Yet, as Clara stared longer, she noticed subtle changes. The snow seemed deeper, heavier, and the decorations hung on the lampposts looked weathered, as though a great weight had passed through. A knock on her door startled her. "Clara?" Her grandmother's voice trembled with relief. Clara opened the door to find Agnes, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Without a word, her grandmother wrapped her in a tight embrace. "I thought I'd lost you," Agnes whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm here," Clara said softly, her voice steadier than she expected. "I made it back." They sat by the fire, sipping tea as Clara recounted her harrowing encounter. She spoke of the wanderer, the shadows, and the guilt she had finally confronted. Agnes listened in silence, her face pale but resolute. When Clara finished, her grandmother sighed, her gaze distant. "You've seen it now," Agnes murmured. "Most don't live to tell the tale. You've been given something rare, a chance to make things right." Clara nodded, the weight of her grandmother's words sinking in. Though she had survived, she knew she couldn't simply leave Hollow Pines behind. Something had changed within her. A spark of purpose, born from the shadows of her guilt. The wanderer had made it clear. Her redemption was only beginning. In the months that followed, Clara settled into life in Hollow Pines, finding comfort in its quiet rhythm. She took over the old bookshop on Main Street, a small but inviting place where townsfolk often lingered to share stories over tea. But Clara's true work began in private, reaching out to those weighed down by secrets and pain, offering them a safe space to unburden their hearts. Word spread quietly through the town. Clara could be trusted. People came to her with confessions they had long buried, their tears spilling as they spoke of wrongs they had done or grief they could not let go. Clara listened without judgment, her own experience with the Wanderer giving her a deep well of empathy. But not everyone was ready to confront their guilt. There were whispers of those who scoffed at Clara's mission, dismissing the Wanderer as an old wives' tale. Clara felt a chill each time she passed their homes at night, the windows dark, as though something waited inside. She knew better than anyone that the Wanderer did not forget. Christmas Eve arrived again, and with it, an unmistakable tension settled over Hollow Pines. Families gathered early, locking their doors and drawing their curtains tight. Clara prepared as she always did, lighting a single candle and placing it in her window. The flame burned steadily, a beacon in the darkness. She sat by the fire, staring at the flickering glow. Her thoughts drifted to Rachel, the memory of her friend's laughter, mingling with the ache of regret. Clara had done all she could to honor Rachel's memory, but the guilt lingered, a quiet shadow she couldn't fully escape. A faint knock at her door broke the silence. Clara froze, her pulse quickening. She approached cautiously, her breath catching as she opened it. There, standing in the snow, was a young boy no older than 10. His clothes were threadbare, his cheeks flushed from the cold. "Are you Miss Clara?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Yes," Clara said, kneeling to meet his gaze. "What's wrong?" "My brother." The boy hesitated, tears welling in his eyes. "He's been acting strange all day. He keeps talking about the fog and says he's seen someone watching him. My parents don't believe him, but I'm scared." Clara's heart sank. She recognized the signs. The boy led her to a small house on the edge of town. Inside, Clara found the boy's older brother sitting by the window, his face pale and drawn. His eyes darted nervously, as though he could see something no one else could. Clara knelt beside him. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Elliot," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Elliot, I need you to tell me what you've seen." Tears spilled down his cheeks. "The shadows. They follow me. I tried to tell the truth, but I was scared. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Clara placed a hand on his trembling shoulder. "It's not too late," she said. "You can still make it right." As she spoke, a faint melody drifted through the air, haunting, familiar. Clara's chest tightened, but she kept her voice calm. "Elliot, listen to me. You have to face it. Whatever you've done, you need to say it aloud." "I stole from Mrs. Porter," Elliot sobbed. "I broke her vase and blamed it on Tommy. He got punished, and I didn't say anything." The shadows that had been gathering at the edges of the room paused, their forms wavering. The melody grew softer, almost mournful. Clara squeezed Elliot's shoulder. "You've taken the first step. Now, you need to make amends." Elliot nodded, his small frame shaking. The shadows dissolved, the room brightening as the tension lifted. Clara exhaled, relief washing over her. She hugged the boy tightly. "You're brave, Elliot. Don't forget that." As Clara walked back home, the snow fell softly around her, blanketing the town in quiet serenity. The candle in her window still burned, its flame unwavering. Clara paused and turned, her eyes scanning the horizon. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, a tall, gaunt silhouette wrapped in shadows. But when she blinked, it was gone, leaving only the gentle snowfall and the promise of a new dawn. Hollow Pines was still haunted by its past, but Clara knew the future held hope. The wanderer had left its mark, but in its wake the town was learning to heal. And so on Christmas Eves to come, the single candle in Clara's window would remain a light for the lost, a symbol of redemption, and a reminder that even in the darkest shadows, there could be salvation.
Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe for more. See you next time.